My name is Sarthak Kesawani, and in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the reflective aspect of this project, alongside my process of planning for the project and the actual implementation itself. So before I proceed on with my reflection of the technical elements of my system, I want to quickly break down the main parts of this presentation and what I'm going to cover in broad terms. So I'll be starting with my overall system design and how I planned out how I was going to execute the implementation, then my key defining design choices, what I personally felt went well, what elements didn't go particularly well, and what I would redo if I had to restart this entire project. So here is my main thought process of how I completed my decision making for what I was going to do for my project. One of the main, most important decisions that I made was my choice to actually go for WPF instead of creating a console app. While this is much more difficult in terms of the actual learning curve required to be able to achieve this, I also felt that it provides a vastly better user experience. And an even bigger reason is which I thought that this would be a very valuable learning experience for myself. And in retrospect, I don't have any regrets in terms of making this decision because I've learned so much. For example, the skills that I've developed using WPF. So my interpretation of the main functionalities. So I guess what that means is when I looked at the assignment brief, how I was going to visualize all the different dashboards in my mind, and I kind of just wrote those all down. So the authentication user management, that would be, I guess, the login for validating user credentials, assigning the roles. Registration, I'll talk more about this decision shortly because this was a big change that I made within my program very early on. The error handling, so just retry logic and the login on how the login would work on an invalid input from the user. The role-based dashboards, that's kind of how I split it out into the various dashboards that will appear based on what user you're logged in as, so admin, nurse, or doctor. And then the main patient dashboard, which all the different users are able to see. So I guess just being able to view all the patients there, um, and of course being able to then zoom in closer on the different patients and see their medical history, what they've been prescribed, their appointments, and just editing the basic details about the patient. And I guess on the main dashboard itself, it has the patient management stuff. So being able to search patients, add new patients, generate the unique hospital and NHS numbers, collect and store the patient details, update the patient details, um, delete the patients from the system if I don't want them there anymore. And then the appointment management, I guess that's quite self-explanatory, but that's broken down into being able to select a patient, the date, the time of the appointment that you want, the available doctor, and validating the doctor to actually be able to see their availability and avoid conflicts. Uh, then modifying the existing appointments, canceling the appointments as required. The medical history and prescriptions, that was a really important thing that I spent a lot of time on during the actual implementation stage. Should have This was one of the shortfalls in terms of I should have planned this one a little bit more. So that's just the viewing, adding, or the editing patient medical history notes, being able to store the notes chronologically, and the prescriptions in terms of adding or editing the prescriptions um, with details like medication, the dosage, the duration. And what I kind of mean that I want to spend more time on the planning for this is that uh, in the end, I did completely fine. Like I was able to get all the functionality for the medical history and prescriptions, but I wouldn't have had to spend as much time doing that implementation if I had planned it, slightly smoothly. Um, so the data management, that'd be the saving and loading of all the data. So in the JSON files, the error handling that detects and handles data for load or save failures with the retry mechanisms, and the error management and feedback. So when anything kind of goes wrong, how am I going to actually handle and report the errors across all the functionalities? So that might be stuff like invalid login credentials, registration input validation failures, data save and load errors, and then I have to guide the users back to the appropriate process for the retry or correction. So this step was quite important for me actually, and in this step of the development process, I chose to create a rough flowchart before programming my main patient record system because it gave me a clear visual blueprint of how the system would actually function. So this means that by mapping out all of the requirements from the previous slide, I could start looking at all the different workflows, I could break down the complexity into much smaller, more manageable steps and ensure that every component was logically connected. It also helped me identify the potential gaps or inefficiencies early on, saving time for my development phase. The flowchart also acts as a guide, keeping my focus organized as I tried to implement each feature. And quite clearly, it did turn out pretty noisy and a complex diagram, but it meant that I could tweak all of the different aspects of the program that I did or didn't like before actually starting the programming. And to be quite frank, this diagram gave me a lot of peace of mind when I was actually programming the actual system. So I spent a lot of time creating this flowchart, but I saved time overall because of in the implementation. I could always look back at this and I would be less confused about all those different small things when I'm actually creating the program. So for this part of the project, I decided very early on to change something big, and I was talking about how I was going to explain this earlier. And by this, I mean the actual registration and approval process. So a key problem for me that was I personally wanted to allow the users of the system themselves to be able to register an account and log in, and this would be much more efficient than an admin having to manually add every account to the system. So now the admin in my system is actually still able to add accounts to the system as per the assignment specification, but I guess the key problem is that if I implement the registration, the self-registration, then if someone unauthorized tries to register an account and log in, it could cause a massive security risk, which is why I added an admin approval process for all of the accounts. So the admin approval process in my system is essential for securing the system. So that means that only authorized users can access sensitive patient data. So now I'm just going to quickly break down the approval process. When a user registers, their data is temporarily stored in a pending underscore users collection, which is serialized to a JSON file called pending underscore users.json. This keeps all of the unapproved registrations in a secure, isolated state. The admin then reviews the pending users in their dashboard and either approves or rejects them. On approval, the user's is approved flag is set to true, and their role is assigned as admin, nurse, or doctor. The user is then deserialized from the pending list and serialized into the main users.json file, which contains all the approved users. When a user attempts to log in, the system deserializes the users.json file to check if the user's status is shown to be is approved is true, if they're marked as active, and if they have a valid role assigned. If any of these checks fail, the user is actually just denied access completely. And I guess that maintains the security aspect of what I was talking about. So the code snippet there at the bottom shows how the admin updates a user's approval status, then serializes the updated users list back into the JSON users.json file, ensuring that the user persists the user data persists and and it's actually securely stored. So by using JSON serialization and deserialization that you taught us in class, the system can efficiently manage user data across all of my various processes, ensuring the security, integrity, and proper role-based access control. So now I'm going to go through the more specific reflective parts of this presentation, almost as if it was kind of like a Scrum or Agile retrospective meeting. So yeah, I'll cover the good, the bad, the ugly in terms of the actual implementation. Starting off with what went well, this project was a significant learning curve for me as a beginner in C Sharp, as I've only ever programmed in Python before this point. So one of the highlights was my successful implementation of object-oriented programming principles. I designed the patient, appointment, and user classes to encapsulate relevant attributes and methods. For instance, the patient class included properties like first name, last name, the auto-generated hospital number, NHS number, and that made my system modular and extendable. Another accomplishment was implementing the login and role-based access system access control for the system. So by using simple conditional logic, I ensured that the appropriate features were available to each user type. So this required a deep understanding of how the conditional statements and event handling stuff works in C Sharp. So to achieve this, I had to, of course, learn Windows Presentation Foundation, so WPF, for the graphical user interface, and this was entirely new to me. And I spent a lot of the time understanding the XAML, data binding, and event handling to create an intuitive and responsive UI. Additionally, I was successful with the JSON serialization and deserialization for the data storage, which helped me persist data without relying on potentially complex databases. These successes show not just what I've achieved, but also kind of the skills that I've gained and applied throughout this project. So here on the screen are some the more specific examples of the particular things I executed well in my program. So firstly, using object-oriented programming, OOP. In the first example, the encapsulated fields ensure that data is managed consistently as I encapsulate the patient first name and I encapsulate the date of birth logic. Secondly, on the right, I've used a hash set for quick lookups because, of course, I need to ensure that the NHS numbers in my system are uniquely generated. Then moving down, there's a sort of short example of where I've used class methods to encapsulate loading logic into reusable methods. Um, then I have an example of where I've used event handlers for the user interface interactivity because it combines the UI interaction with validation. And at the bottom there, I have an example of where I've used list filtering. So I'm filtering data based on conditions and adding to another list. Next, in terms of what I could have done better, while this project achieved its functional goals, there are definitely areas where I can improve. So using JSON files for data storage, of course, it does work well for this sort of project, but um, you know, in a real life scenario where I need to handle concurrent user access, using JSON files would pose limitations. So, for example, if two users try to modify the same file simultaneously, conflicts would inevitably occur. This highlighted the need to explore alternative like SQL databases for better scalability and reliability. I also noticed a lot of code repetition, particularly in data loading functions. For example, loading patients and appointments involved a lot of similar logic in multiple parts of the application. And at the time, I was focused on more getting the functionality to work. But looking back now, I could have refactored this logic into more reusable methods or utility classes. This not only would have reduced the redundancy, but also would have made the code easier to maintain and debug, and probably would have saved me a lot of time. And another quite funny challenge I faced was adapting to the American spelling for keywords like serialize and initialize. Since, of course, we're all accustomed to British English, it was tricky to remember all of these strange differences at first. But it helped me pay attention, uh, to like the detail of being able to follow the conventions in programming. And finally, if I were to do this project again, I would start incorporating more advanced programming concepts while building on the foundational skills that I've developed. So one improvement would be the use of asynchronous programming, which I've only done in Python before, specifically using async await for tasks like loading data from the JSON files. This would make the application more responsive, especially when working with the larger data sets or handling potential multi-user scenarios, which is, of course, more realistic. And another thing I kind of really want to explore the MVVM model view model design pattern in WPF. So at the time, I was more focused on writing code behind logic to handle the UI events, but this approach kind of made it harder to separate the different concerns. So MVVM would allow me to better structure the code by, I guess, separating the UI, which would be the view, logic, which would be the view model, and the data, which would be the model. And of course, this is a kind of a more advanced uh, concept, but starting with this, I'd imagine that starting with like simple data bindings and commands would make it easier and more approachable for me as a relative beginner. And finally, I'd pay more attention to implementing accessibility features such as text to speech or keyboard navigation, which I didn't prioritize this time. So these changes would not only improve the user experience, but also enhance the overall quality of the application. So throughout this project, I feel I've learned so many new techniques, OOP, WPF for UI development, JSON for data handling, and event-driven programming, just to name a few. But I also feel like I have a much deeper appreciation for small stuff like debugging, especially in regards to the even smaller things like spelling differences or missing semicolons, which has caused me repeated issues as it causes everyone issues really. And I think that this journey overall has taught me, I guess, the importance of the careful planning, thorough testing, and continuously improving my skills. So overall, I think I really enjoyed this entire project and I learned so much from it. So thank you for listening.